So we see that there are many issues on a variety of levels relating to the oil impacts on the Gulf of Mexico. Let's turn to the scientists here today to discuss these issues in more detail. Bob.
Well, thank you very much. Our guests in this segment are both from the Gulf Coast Research Lab in Ocean Springs, and Dr. Mark Peterson, who you've already met, is a professor of coastal sciences at the lab. And our new guest is Dr. Patrick Biber, who's an associate professor of coastal sciences also at the lab. Welcome. Good to have you all with us today.
Good to be here.
A common theme that we've heard a lot about after the oil spill has been this issue of interconnectivity in ecosystems. And it's sort of a recurring theme that people keep wanting to talk about because it's very important. Tell us a little bit, Mark, if you will, about that interconnectivity of species, especially in the realm of food webs.
Sure.
How they relate to us as citizens of the coast.
Okay. It tends to be a complex sort of process, and it's hard for non-scientists to understand, but an easy way to think about it is organisms that tend to spawn offshore, for example, like crabs or shrimp, a number of fishes, move inshore into the salt marsh nursery areas for protection from predators, for food and whatnot. So that interconnectivity there, within that argument, they also feed in different places in terms of the food web aspect, and they utilize different resources, whether inshore in estuaries or offshore in the Barrier Islands, or even up in rivers. A lot of these systems in our part of the world are very river dominated, and a classic example of this is the Gulf sturgeon. One of the fishes that I work on is a threatened species. They spawn upriver as adults, and they spend about 6 months upriver. They do not feed. And then they move back down. The juveniles and smaller individuals stay in the estuary proper, but the adults move to the Barrier Islands, and they feed all winter long, and then they start that cycle over again. And so there's a huge connectivity. If you put up dams, you put up blockades, they can't complete that life cycle. And these animals don't understand state lines or county lines or any kind of barriers. They just simply have evolved to sort of do things they do. And so if you break that connectivity, you break down the food web in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. O'Connell mentioned in the video about after the Exxon Valdez spill in Prince William Sound that the first year the herring fishery was very strong, and it was strong the next couple of years, and in the fourth year it absolutely collapsed. Knowing that you're not necessarily a specialist in herring, what does that really mean in the Gulf of Mexico? Are we watching that, see if it happens there?
Well, I think some people are probably doing that. I know. There's probably three ways that you can look at this sort of longer-term decline, if you will. One is there's immediate impact, so you impact the adult stock or the juvenile offspring that would become adults the next season by direct impact of the oil, and certainly a lot of that did happen. The second, and a little bit less understandable, is the impact on reproduction of these fish. If you can have a small impact early, and it might build from one spawning cycle to the next spawning cycle in adults, and that's sort of a cumulative impact to where you can then see the population size going down. As the population size reduces because of reduced reproduction, then your spawning stock biomass, the number that's out there, can be impacted. And third, the sort of long-term impact in my mind, because I work on juvenile fishes, the inshore component, when those that do survive and that make it in maybe on a lesser spawn from adults that recruit into salt marsh areas like we have, not so much Prince William Sound, but they can be re-impacted by any oil that might be still left in the sediment, because a lot of them feed in the sediment when they're juveniles down in these areas, and can sort of influence themselves and such that they won't make it back to the spawning grounds as they get older. So there's probably 3 or 4, maybe even more of those. Herring is sort of an intriguing thing. There's been a lot of money and a lot of study of those for decades, and they still really don't have the answer. So it's not as simple as the oil's gone, right, fish are back this year, everything's great. It's much more complex.
Are there any particular species in the Gulf of Mexico that we're particularly concerned about?
I think I know that far offshore, some of our colleagues at the lab are working on bluefin tuna, and they're working on things like red drum and other sport fish. Jim Frank spoke here last time and talked about that, and so there's people looking at those exact things, but they're concerned about blue crabs, very important economically. They have this sort of estuarine dependent spawning offshore, moving inshore sort of pattern, shrimp as well. And you saw certainly after Katrina that the shrimp and crabs were really abundant because they reduced harvest of those. But now that they're back harvesting, they've come back to a level, and it's about where it used to be. So clearly Katrina didn't impact them as much as we had originally thought. but this oil hanging on in the environment, this disappearing oil that people keep talking about, until we figure out that impact, it could be a much longer process like they saw in Alaska.
Okay, yeah, that's very important. Dr. Suzanne Friedrich talked about her work with algae in the Gulf of Mexico, especially, she looks at how its presence affects the amount of oxygen that's bioavailable in the water column, and she's very concerned about the impacts on oil. Patrick, why is that so important? Why are scientists concerned about that?
Well, the seaweeds, like many of the other organisms that are primary producers in the Gulf, those include phytoplankton. Mm-hmm. They also include submerged aquatic vegetation, and people might also consider salt marsh plants being important primary producers. So all of those plants do produce oxygen as a byproduct. And they are important habitat as well for many of the organisms, including some of the juveniles of species that Mark talked about earlier.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Brad Rosenheim mentioned the problem with hypoxia and anoxia, the low oxygen, no oxygen. What is that? What does that really mean?
So generally, when you have these kinds of conditions, they tend to set up in the summer during warmer water conditions. Warmer water contains less oxygen. Usually hypoxia and anoxia set up when there's a lot of phytoplankton blooming. Those phytoplankton don't all get consumed by organisms. Some of them die and sink to the bottom and are then broken down by bacteria. As those bacteria break down the dead organic matter from the phytoplankton, they're using up oxygen and will quickly use up all the available oxygen in the bottom waters. The problem of that is that animals require oxygen to survive, so if there's insufficient oxygen to support animal life like fish or crabs, then you get a die-off. A big example of that in the northern Gulf is the dead zone just to the west of the Mississippi River mouth, which fuels large phytoplankton blooms in the spring with all the nutrients that come down from the river.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Friedrich also discussed the algal communities that she studies mostly in deep water systems, but she's very concerned about shifting, that there might always be algae there, but it might go from large algae to a smaller form of algae. Does that have any impact on the fisheries that you study?
It certainly can. I mean, there's been enough work on that, looking at sort of shifting from one sort of community structure, if you will. Usually fish guys look at as vegetation as habitat for organisms. And if you shift that to a different kind, either a more structurally complex or a less structurally complex, you get different prey availability on those things, in part because of that complexity. And though fishes might shift to different places because of in many ways, food availability, protection from predators, the things that make juvenile habitat really important to these young, or habitat for these young juveniles. The other thing is that the normal prey that these things might feed on may not colonize a different structure. And so it's, again, a complex sort of thing, but the animals seem to know that. And some new structural components may not make much difference, but some might make a big difference.
Mm-hmm. How about the shallow bed, grass beds that you work on, Patrick?
We haven't seen much effect of the oil on those plants at this time. It's a little uncertain as to whether there might be longer-term effects. I think we saw in one of the earlier segments, Alex mentioned that oil in the sediments of the marshes was a concern. Similarly, for seagrasses, they would have the same kinds of problems as the marsh plants, with oil in the sediment affecting the roots and potentially causing mortality. So yes, that is a long-term concern of mine.
Okay, good. Well, one of the things that Dr. Andrew Whitehead in the video was talking about the impact of future storms, where they might mobilize some of the oil that's offshore and bring it inshore where it comes in contact. What are your concerns about that? Do you really think that that's going to happen? Does the scientific community really have a handle on that yet?
I don't think we have a good handle on it, at least on the biology side of things. Certainly if there's significant oil in deep waters that's easily mobilized, that could come on shore, I could see that as a potential, problem for the next year or so, that we may see some oil coming up into the nearshore environment because of this deep pool. But it depends a lot on how quickly that oil might degrade and how quickly it might also settle out into the sediments, where it would be a little less available to be moved.
Right. So even though we don't know about it today, we think that it'll lessen as time goes on.
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you very.
One little interjection.
Yes.
One thing about marsh sediments is that it can get buried very quickly, and a lot of times when it's re-exposed, it sometimes in the literature would suggest that it still can be somewhat toxic. So it may not always go away, or might not always be broken down, because if it's separated from the oxygen, it's more problematic breaking it down.
Well, that's
and you
an
have that in
excellent
salt
point.
marshes.
Excellent point. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The BP oil disaster has created an unprecedented opportunity and need for scientists to create new ways of working together and to share data. Scientists from several Louisiana universities gave us their thoughts on these opportunities and avenues of scientific collaboration.
I think with the oil spill, and I'm being hopeful here, it has made researchers realize they have to work together. It made researchers realize the value of their work. It goes beyond just having a publication. This is a way of recognizing the value not only of us in academia, but also the value of the people in the federal and state agencies who have these data, who are now actually newly, this is something new, federal agencies releasing the data from certain aspects in the Gulf. So it is something. I think it's a new opening, and the idea that this is an excuse to, we need to start sharing data just for the benefit of the public.
It actually shows how different fields and different sciences can come together and provide a better assessment for the impact of disasters. For example, in our project, it shows how physics, ecology, mathematics, statistics can all be combined to provide an assessment of the BP disaster on the marine mammals. Furthermore, recently we've been contacted by NOAA. NOAA is actually performing similar acoustic experiments. So we started now discussion, and we hope that whatever data and analysis we conduct and whatever data and analysis they conduct can be shared, and hence instead of one data set we will have several data sets providing corroborating evidence whether there has been an effect to this species or not.
This spill scientifically, and I'm probably speaking for a lot of scientists, not just myself, but it's opened up a lot of new collaborations. As I said, I'm a paleoclimatologist, a paleoceanographer, and I use geochemistry as my tool, different aspects of geochemistry. That also turns out to be a very good tool for tracking oil, especially as it gets incorporated into our environment. So this has opened up collaborative doors for me to work with other scientists, some who've had a lot more experience working with oil, which is necessary because I need to learn a lot from them, and hopefully they'll learn a lot from me. So there have been opportunities that come out of this in terms of being able to ask new scientific questions.
So what scientists have to get a handle on is some integrated measure of exposure of sensitive habitats across the Gulf. And there are lots of sources of information there. Many of them are dispersed between different agencies and different groups and in different areas. So what is really important is for us to figure out a way of integrating all those sources of information from people on the ground saying, I have a georeference site of oil here, versus people that have a chemistry sample from that site, where they've done the analytical chemistry, people that have a sediment sample from that site, and also integrating all the remote sensing data from the satellites into some integrated measure of exposure across time and across this geographical region. We need to figure out a way of having a central searchable database to access those data from.
The work that Chris Jenkins does at the University of Colorado with his program DCBED, it's very cutting edge, the fact that they can actually bring these data together and make them work together.
If you want to see the interconnectivity of disciplines, this is the time that it really is exemplified. Everything from a good writer, a good reporter, to someone who understands microbes is important in a situation like this. I am not a microbiologist, but I live and die right now by what the microbiologists are telling me about the decomposition rate of oil, and I've read up on it and I've had to learn about it. That's a totally different discipline from my own. By the same token, I'm not a geographic information system person that's doing a lot of the mapping, but it's mighty important to me right now how you map out this oil spill. And so we're the biologists in the middle, and there's many kinds of us. There's thousands of different kinds of experts that are needed right now. So it may sound like, oh gosh, here goes another expert. shooting off his mouth. We need many different kinds of experts right